All right, good to go. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, hosted by Economic Research Southern Africa and funded through the International Economic Partnership Program. For those of you that don't know, this is the third webinar in a four-part series. The first two was on growth enhancing infrastructure and industrial incentives. This can be, the full video recordings can be accessed on our YouTube page, eventually on our podcast channel as well. The final one, which will happen next week, is on development finance, and that will happen next week at Thursday at 10 a.m. So please make sure to follow that on the ERSA LinkedIn page. Is probably the easiest. Also, just a reminder, towards the end, we're going to send you a link to a survey, which would be great to get your feedback on that. Okay, so the goal today, we want to create a space to not only to reflect on South Africa's industrial policy framework, but also to learn from best practices in comparative countries. So our keynote, Philipp Lamprecht, will really give us a good indication of what other countries are doing. You will notice. We want to bring together the excellent panel today of local and international researchers, as well as private sector participants, to bring a diversity of evidence, perspectives, and practical experience. We want to encourage the audience members to also critically engage with the discussion and add concrete reflections and recommendations that key stakeholders can consider. You will see there will be a chat function and a Q&A function where you are able to provide your input. And then also reflect on the work, where the gaps are, and how policy can be improved. The primary objective of the session is to critically examine the effectiveness of South Africa's public procurement framework in supporting our industrial policy objectives, while also exploring forward-looking reforms informed by international experience and comparative best practices. During the webinar, we will engage with a series of questions. Some of them will go a little bit deeper on, some of them a little bit lighter on maybe. But just to give you some idea, how has Africa's public procurement framework advanced our industrial policy objectives? So our panel might be able to give us some reflection on that, and reflecting on the design, coordination, implementation, what aspects are working well and where is improvement needed, and drawing on international experience, and finally looking ahead, which two or three, or what are the policy reforms that South African government could consider to accelerate our industrialization or move that forward. We are delighted to have a distinguished panel of experts with us to explore these issues, share insights, and engage in the constructive discussion. Just to give you an idea of the program, so once I've done a bit of an introduction of all the panelists and a welcoming, I'll hand over to the keynote presentation by Philipp Lamprecht, who will talk about the economic impact of local content requirements through an international case study of heavy vehicles. We will then go into, after that will take about 15 minutes. After that, we'll go into a facilitated panel discussion for just under an hour. So it really is our panelists discussing what their views are with each other. Hopefully we'll get some nice argument here and there to really kind of get the different views and the perspectives. We'll then do a 30-minute Q&A session, followed by the closing remarks by the presenters and the panelists, and the closing and thanks by me. We should be done by sharply at 4 o'clock. So hopefully all of you will stick around for it. Thank you so much. All right, just to introduce you to everyone. So our keynote presentation will be by Philipp Lamprecht, who is the director of the European Center for International Political Economy, in charge of overseeing fundraising activities in addition to his trade economist research work. He holds a PhD from LSE with a specialization in international political economy. Ryan Brunette is a research associate with the Public Affairs Research Institute. Ryan does research on the formulation of over long periods of time of public administration, sorry about that. He is particularly interested in understanding the ways in which such institutions are embedded in and intertwined with broader social contexts. David Walwyn is a professor at the Graduate School of Technology Management at the University of Pretoria. David is a transdisciplinary scholar who is focused on two important research questions: localization of manufacturing in the health and energy sectors, and transformation of socio-technical systems, especially systems for mobility and electricity. Then our gender specialist, Annie Sugrue, is a director at ECOSASA Development, a great partner of the International Economic Partnership Consortium. So we're very happy to have her here. Annie is an established leader and innovator across the development sector in sustainable development, green economy, climate change, small business development, women economic empowerment, and financial inclusion. And then, wait, is that all? Yeah, well, that is a lot. But that's essentially who is going to be joining us today. So once again, just from me, thank you so much. For those of you that don't know, my name is Bashir Fenter. I am Executive Director of Economic Research Southern Africa. Full disclosure, I will be directing the conversation, but I won't be joining in. This isn't really my area, but I'm really, really excited to be able to learn from our distinguished panelists and presenters today, and I hope everyone is equally excited. So thank you so much. I'll hand over to Philipp Lamprecht right now. Thanks.
Thank you very much for this introduction, and let me first share my screen. I hope you can all see the presentation. And I wanted to start also by thanking you for considering me as a keynote speaker for this event, and that I'm also honored to be part of this discussion with such prestigious panelists. And without much further ado, I'm happy to lay a bit of the theoretical framework and also general framework for discussion for this event. So I'm going to present a study that we at ECIPE have done a couple of years ago on an estimation of the economic impact of LCRs in the case of the heavy vehicle sector. And in particular, we have analyzed the BRICS countries, so also including South Africa in the study. And what I'm going to present is the overall study as an example of an assessment of economic impacts of LCRs, which also is going to show us quite a lot about the different dynamics, first of all, of how LCRs can impact the economic sectors that they affect directly, but also the general economy of a country and also beyond. But we're also going to dive into policy options and finally important considerations and an outlook regarding what is important when it comes to designing LCRs, what choices can be made when it comes to policy on LCRs, and both opportunities and also limitations. So first, I'm going to outline the research process of the study that we have done, this academic assessment that we have done. Then I'm going to present the research methodology. It was a multi-year project that I'm going to outline very briefly. I'm going to present the results of the impact analysis and impact assessment that we have done, and I'm going to provide an outlook. So first of all, when it comes to outlining the research process, as I mentioned, was a multi-year process at our institute in Brussels. And the first aspect, of course, that is important is to define the subject of analysis. So what are local content requirements? By a definition of the OECD, these are policies imposed by governments that require firms to use domestically manufactured goods or domestically supplied services in order to operate in an economy. And now we start with the first important point, which is both limitations and opportunities of LCRs. And here it is important to note that in the literature, the economic literature on local content requirements, oftentimes they are portrayed as a policy measure that is protectionist and that has a lot of limitations per se. However, I don't want to offer only such a limited view, because LCRs do also offer a lot of opportunities, and they can also have economic benefits and a purpose in the policy making, for example, in South Africa. But the important point is that considering the limitations of LCRs, choices that can be made during the design of LCRs to be used and also implementation of the LCRs, they are very important because LCRs can actually have limitations for the economy. For example, they can have negative impacts for the overall economy, for downstream firms, for internationally operating firms, and also for consumers, which I'm going to outline now. What we have done in this research process is to map the growing use of LCRs in the world economy. I mean, we observed especially an increase of these protectionist, more trade defensive measures since the financial crisis, but of course also in current times. And the first overview in our study is simply that we find that certain countries used a lot of LCRs as compared to others. So main users include, for example, India, Brazil, also Saudi Arabia, and then you see US, Russia, Indonesia, Argentina, fairly similar. So we do see a landscape. This is the first aspect I'm exploring on, the landscape of LCRs internationally. So we do see that certain countries are using them quite a lot, and in particular, India and Brazil, for example. What we have then done is a sectoral overview of what is out there, so of the currently implemented local content requirements. And we find that a lot of these local content requirements, so a lot of these policy measures are used or employed in the automotive sector, but also in ICT and also in energy and oil and gas. So we see that there are quite a lot of use cases for LCRs, but specific sectors are more prone to LCR use than others. And so for example, automotive is a key sector, and that led us to the research that I'm presenting here, which is on the automotive sector, so employed in a lot of countries and also a sector of priority for policymakers. And we wanted to dive in to a specific subsector in the automotive sector, which is the heavy vehicle sector. So what we have done is to establish an ECIPE local content requirement database of LCRs that affect the heavy vehicles in the BRICS. We identified 72 different LCRs. So each Brazil and Russia had 20 measures, India 15, China 13, and South Africa 4. And most of the LCRs that we found were related to government procurement, financial support, business operations, and export measures. And we then had a cost dimension of LCRs, which is three-dimensional. So we analyzed the impact of those LCRs, high, medium, and low. We analyzed the scope. They can either be horizontal across the economy, sector specific, which would be automotive sector, or subsector specific, which would be heavy vehicle sector. And there are different types of LCRs, of course, that we also analyzed. So we set up the database according to these three parameters, and we found that financial support and business operations LCRs generally have a high impact. And now briefly to present the research methodology. So we used an econometric model which translated the cost of the collected LCRs by an estimation into AVEs, so ad valorem equivalents. So LCRs basically pose certain barriers to international trade, and using an econometric model, we translated them to tariff rate equivalents. And these tariff rate equivalents were then plugged into a general equilibrium model, which is a simulation conducted with the standard global trade analysis project, so GTAP project at the University of Purdue, the most advanced model at the year available. And what we found is significant results in the form of high tariff equivalence. So translated into tariff rates, the LCRs that we found, so the overall 72 LCRs, translated in a weighted tariff of 18.2%, for example, in Brazil, 3.7% in Russia, 9.5% in China, and 13% in South Africa. And we also included India with 9.3%. So for trade experts, these numbers are high. A tariff increase of 13 or 18% is high. I know in current times we are experiencing much higher tariffs by the United States, for example, which partly are prohibitively high, but 18.2%, for example, is a high increase. And what we did find now is first of all that I'm now going into the overview of the results. What we have found is that yes, these LCRs have increased industry output in the automotive sectors of these countries, so of the BRICS countries. The LCRs have led to an economic increase in output of the heavy vehicle sector and the automotive sector. So this is the first finding. Yes, LCRs do have a positive impact, and they do have, so to say, justification for existing. They are a tool in the toolbox of policymakers that can have a desired effect. But there are limitations, and this is now the slide that I'm showing here. We have found that despite the output increase in the specific sector of automotives, we found that there is a decrease of industry output in other sectors. So, for example, we see a decrease in the other transport equipment sector, the other machinery sector, and also electronics. In China, we see in South Africa a decrease also in the similar sectors, especially Brazil showed large decrease in other sectors, manufactured goods, electronics, other transport equipment, other machinery, and Russia too. So a first point is that in this specific example, the LCRs reduced economic output of the countries that implemented them more highly in other sectors than the positive gains in the targeted sector of the LCR itself. We also found that trade was affected. So I talked about economic output. We also found that heavy vehicles trade in BRICS countries was affected. They imported much less internationally. For example, in the case of South Africa, imports were reduced by 6%. And also they exported less. So the export capacity was reduced as well when it comes to the specific subsector of heavy vehicles. I'm going to dive a bit more into the theory behind it later on. And what we also found is that EU trade with the BRICS in heavy vehicles was affected too. So also the international partners, such as the EU, exported less, which is naturally, of course, can be expected. They exported less to BRICS, so the trade relations were quite heavily affected. For example, in the case of South Africa, EU exports to BRICS to South Africa was reduced by 6.48%, so also quite significant. And this shows that there are, I'm now finalizing the overview of the results of our study, there are negative effects. We also saw negative effects on consumer prices, which went up. And to talk a bit about the theory, so basically what we see is an increase in prices, usually also in the sectors that are affected by LCRs, for example, automotive and also heavy vehicles. And this requires also that suppliers in the industry need to divert resources away from other areas to the specific sector of heavy vehicles, just to be able to afford parts, just to be able to afford the final products. And so we also see that LCRs can have a negative effect on the whole economy by increasing prices, reducing product variation, product availability, reducing funding available for innovation, and aspects like this. Also, consumer choice can be reduced. So there are these negative effects, but as I mentioned, there are also positive output effects. So policymakers, we found in our study, could engage in an increased use of complaints through the WTO dispute settlement body. It's also important, of course, to target to start negotiations that are targeting LCRs in the World Trade Organization. And in case, and this is especially true in current times, the entire membership would not support this, then we should have a negotiation by a coalition of the willing to learn more about the use of LCRs and also to address the use of detrimental LCRs or purely protectionist LCRs. What is a very important point too is that we should also increase the availability of economic analysis on the use of and implementation of LCRs. LCRs are increasingly complex. They are an ever more regulatory embedded policy choice to make. They are impacts are sometimes difficult to foresee, and this is posing a problem also for international companies, because they sometimes have a hard time understanding what exactly the impact will be of a specific LCR. That's particularly true when LCRs are formulated vaguely by policymakers. And so it is important to make specific choices, to do the LCR implementation well, to make it in a transparent way and in a specific way that is understood by everybody, international players, also domestic players. And it is also important to have a lot of research available in order to understand LCRs better, and also to know the impact of LCRs that they can have, because they are getting more and more complex. Of course, we should also have bilateral negotiations, for example, in the EU FTAs, but also FTAs of other countries. LCRs should be front and center, because they are a very important policy tool that requires attention. Otherwise, it can have negative impacts. And as an outlook, I wanted to dive into the also opportunities of LCRs, because we see in the literature, and what I've just presented in the form of the study is one case study that a little bit serves to be an example for our following discussion, but also provides a framework. So we have seen that LCRs can have negative impacts on the economy. I talked about output, I talked about trade, I talked about consumer prices, less funding for innovation, less consumer choice, higher costs, spillover effects into other economic sectors. And so there are these limitations of LCRs, but there are also a lot of opportunities. I also mentioned output in the specific sector increased. This could be, for example, very helpful for nascent industries or industries that should be protected. But the crux, so to say, lies in the policy making, and LCRs should be best understood as a tradecraft of policymakers. So a tool of economic diplomacy where the ultimate impact and also the utility, the benefit of LCRs for the government and the country that is employing them depends on the choices made by policymakers, sound understanding and economic analysis of the impacts of LCRs, and careful design during the design process of the LCRs, and careful decisions what LCRs and how they are employed. We see different types of LCRs. We have, for example, local content incentives, we have requirements, we have local operations incentives, local labor requirements, local value added requirements. The coverage of LCRs can differ. They can be firm specific, they can be horizontal, they can be sector specific, can focus on state controlled entities, SMEs, they can be location specific. So policymakers have a lot of choices to make. And to conclude in my final 2 minutes, I wanted to stress that the tradecraft of designing LCRs requires careful decision-making based on analysis and research for tailored and targeted implementation. So I mean this not only by sector, but sometimes it's even important to understand the dynamics of how companies operate, for example, also international companies. Policymakers need to take into account the idiosyncratic characteristics of sectors, as well as the way in which specific firms in the sectors operate, also internationally. And this is important because negative examples of the use of LCRs do exist. We have seen it. And the case study that we have done is just one example where our modeling showed that despite the benefits, negative impacts were there, they were visible. And with other more complex LCRs, for policymakers, it just becomes more and more important to have also resources available for economic research, for analysis, and also for tailored expertise and tailored policymaking. So to sum up, and as my final comment, as I reached 15 minutes, is coherence, effectiveness, and impact. These are the issues we discussed during the event today. Of these interventions, they do depend also on design and choices, on design and choices by policymakers. So we should not believe economic literature which says LCRs are purely protectionist and always in a zero-sum game detrimental. This is also not true, but it is true that LCRs are not per se the perfect instrument for even protecting specific subsectors. They can have detrimental impacts. They should be carefully designed, carefully considered. You should talk to international companies, and you should be precise, transparent, and not vague when it comes to the design. Thank you very much.
Sorry, I was just looking for my buttons there. Philipp, thank you so much. Before I hand over, I think we'll go to Ryan first as a first responder. I just want to ask Philipp to expand a little bit. So you're saying that where the LCR is implemented, there's generally positive economic impacts, but there are these spillovers, and there are ways in which, and there are the negative effects empirically proven in your study as well. But it's not clear to me. Do you have a sense of how to prevent? Is there something kind of obvious to how to prevent the negative externalities of these of the local content requirements?
Yes, so there are some broad, I mean, as I mentioned, this is part of the story. The use of LCRs should be quite tailored. So we are really, it is really important which sectors we are talking about. It is really important which companies we are dealing with. Companies work in different ways, and it also depends on many economic factors. But there are a couple of broad elements that should always be done. So one part of good LCR strategy is, for example, as I mentioned, to have clear understanding and economic research on the impacts. So governments, policymakers, they should engage in impact assessments of LCRs before. A second point is that we have seen LCRs that are in their form, in their written form, they are vague, they are uncertain, and this creates huge problems for international companies, for example, because they and this is where the problems begin, because they do not know exactly what to expect from the LCR. They do not know the room for interpretation that is left open. They are unsure what this will mean down the years, in the next years, what exactly to do. And this type of vagueness, we have observed it. It can even affect the business strategy of large multinational companies. They can decide that a market, an entire market, gets deprioritized if LCRs are designed in a way that they simply need to employ a lot of resources. They need to conduct a lot of outreach to the government, to ministries, to stakeholders. They need to engage in their own research. They need to even hire legal experts just to find out to understand it, what exactly it means. And these are costs, sunken costs for companies. And the good use of LCRs would minimize these costs for other players. Because of course LCRs want to protect certain industries in specific countries, for example, South Africa. But of course, policymakers do not aim to completely be defensive against international, very innovative, very competitive companies. They don't want to shut them out forever from the market either, or they don't want to shut them out from the whole operations perspective, that the company, the multinational, decides, okay, let's deprioritize the entire market. So the costs of LCRs should be understandable. So first is the first element would be own understanding needs to be high. Second element would be costs should be understandable. And then there's a third element of use of LCRs, which is that they should also usually, this is what we've seen. I mean, I'm now generalizing because they are so specific, but usually what we've seen, what works best is if LCRs give or offer incentives to companies rather than clear exclusionary requirements. I mean, just one example is that we've analyzed the so-called economic participation policy in Saudi Arabia, and we found that it poses significant problems for the healthcare sector in the Saudi Arabia kingdom, because international companies, for example, by United States, were seriously unsure how to deal with them. I mean, this policy required companies to reinvest just a figure of 35% of a tender's total value back into Saudi Arabia. And so under this policy, companies wishing to bid on respective government contracts must demonstrate that their value of local economic participation will equal 35% of the value of imports of goods or services. So there was just this figure of 35%. And the healthcare companies in the US, they were completely unsure how to do this and also where this figure of 35% came from. And they were not sure how to meet this requirement. And they described it as exclusionary, so exclusion of the market. And what my point here is that if you design an LCR and you just say 35% without truly knowing or having talked to other partners internationally what this 35% will mean, then it might be better, for example, to arrive at the same effect through another way, which could be incentive-based, so that certain companies have something to gain if they choose themselves to collaborate with local partners more. So we should have research on the impacts. We should know very well the impacts beforehand. Design matters. LCRs should be designed clearly, transparently, and not vague. And incentives, giving incentives, oftentimes is better than having requirements, because it is difficult to foresee if international companies might not be excluded because of requirements. These are just 3 broad planks.
That's great. And I think that really sets us up. Thank you so much, Philipp, for that. All right. I think what I'll do now is I'll hand over to Ryan for first response. I think, we have about 10 minutes per person, but I'm happy for Ryan and Philipp to kind of have a bit of a back and forth too. So Ryan, feel free to also ask questions in your response.
Sure. My understanding was that I was going to kind of just give like a wait. Okay, so we're doing the response first. Okay. There's a bit of a because like there were 3 questions, and I thought we were going through the questions in order. Okay, so just in terms of the response to Philipp, I think it's very interesting work, especially given what I think is a kind of dearth of work in this area in South Africa, especially on the kind of broader externalities of our local content designations and regulations and so on. And I find it kind of compelling for a number of reasons. And I guess I'll provide something of a kind of counter argument. I think this only goes so far. But my sense is, your analysis is, really kind of focused on kind of short-term, let's say, kind of static inefficiencies in terms of raising prices, misallocating resources in the market as it exists now. But obviously the goal of industrial policy, generally speaking, is to create kind of more long-term dynamic efficiencies, which induce learning in certain sectors, build capabilities, expand kind of positive externalities, economies of agglomeration, and so on and so forth. We could talk about other sorts of things which we see, for example, in the pharmaceutical industry, which I think David will talk about, which is that, like kind of supply chain sovereignty and security and so on and so forth. That's probably less of a factor in the case of heavy vehicles, of course. The real kind of question, I think, is whether, say in South Africa, whether our kind of heavy vehicle local content requirements are producing that kind of dynamic effect. I think it's probably the case that it's not, to a significant extent, and we can kind of talk about why. But more broadly, given that this is a kind of process of learning, building capabilities, and moving along, not only in these sectors, but also in the state, there may be kind of strong arguments for kind of continuing to kind of muddle through, right? Kind of increasingly that seems to be necessary, just given the way in which the kind of global trade system, the direction that it's moving in. I'm sure you'd be kind of like aware of the history. Industrial policy has been kind of practiced at some point by almost every kind of industrial power, I mean, probably everyone that I can think of, whether the UK, kind of continental Europe, the USA, for an extended period of time, East Asia, and so on. Increasingly practiced, I mean, it seems to be increasingly practiced by these powers, not so much Europe, but certainly the United States at this point. I mean, the United States, as you show in your data, has more local content requirements than South Africa at this point. The United States is also, I mean, I haven't really looked into this, but I mean, I'm sure it's flagrantly violating World Trade Organization rules and so on and so forth at this point. And so, which is all kind of to say that, the playing field has arguably never been fair, given, existing kind of economies of agglomeration and so on in the industrial powers. And we seem to be entering an era of kind of geopolitical competition where, there's little prospect of it becoming fairer in future. And so, should we, I mean, you're not quite making this argument. You're not saying that we should abandon industrial policy. But were we to follow that route of kind of like, using World Trade Organization rules to kind of suppress local content regulations, it seems like this would kind of like be effectively kind of tying South Africa's hands in a context where, other countries are broadly kind of supporting their industries and we may not be. So, I mean, I guess this kind of all leads to a question, which is, how does your analysis kind of play out in this kind of new world that seems to be emerging, and how should kind of South Africa respond to that?
If I could,
that's all I have.
Thank you very much, Ryan. If I could just for a couple of seconds respond. First of all, I entirely agree with your points. I also want to mention that local content requirements as a policy tool, of course, are not the exhaustive breadth of industrial policy, which goes far, far beyond only local content requirements. It's one, so what I presented was one single policy tool. And yeah, I completely agree. I think in the current world that we live in, unfortunately, we see that a lot of countries are getting more protectionist. And South Africa as a country was a very minor case study in our research. So what we showed actually is that South Africa uses much less LCRs than many other countries. So it's kind of one of the good guys in this respect. But the question, of course, is where do we go from there? Where do we go exactly as you pointed out? Where should South African policymakers go from here in a world that becomes apparently more and more protectionist, that also becomes more and more, I'm sorry to say, disconnected from the WTO, to put it like this, more fragmented. And my main point was to set the scene. It was to show that there are different ways of doing industrial policy, different ways of doing LCRs. And when it comes to LCRs, it's important to get it right, because some LCRs, yes, they can protect certain economies, certain sectors, sorry, they can protect them. But then as an add-on effect, they hurt the entire economy of, let's say, South Africa. And that's not what we want, of course. We want efficient protection, but not exclusion and not less economic gain in the entire rest of the economy that outweigh the benefits. So the main point is that in terms of economic diplomacy, so the tradecraft of this policy of making and designing and employing LCRs, you need to do it very carefully. And maybe one point from my presentation to take away is, for South African policymakers, we live in a strange world, we live in strange times. It seems that people become more and more protectionist, but this still means that with very complex policy measures like local content requirements, you should do your homework first, because definitely you shouldn't hurt yourself.
Ryan, I mean, you can take another minute to respond to that, and then we can move on to the next person too.
Well, I mean, maybe I'll just like make one more comment. I mean, as I said, I think it's like very arguable that, I mean, like our local content requirements are, almost like first tentative step into industrial strategy, and they really do need to be kind of like supported by a whole range of interventions. and as you say, kind of arguably structured in different ways. I mean, you mentioned before that rather incentivize than restrict and so on and so forth. But also there's I mean, they could be kind of more performance based. They could be. I mean, there's a whole range of things that we might do. I mean, my sense is that we're probably not quite there in terms of capacity, in terms of the Department of Trade and Industry and so on. But there's another point there, which is like, there's, because almost like inevitably you're going to have kind of like some short-term costs. And, the real question is whether you can kind of like, leverage this policy to the extent that it creates long-term advantages. And yeah, I mean, I'm not sure like if your analysis is capturing that. Because it does seem to be static in terms of the short term. But that's not so. I mean, obviously you can't do everything in one paper, but yeah.
It's just to say completely right, and just for transparency to our audience, these are the limitations of the modeling. So if they go, the computable general equilibrium models that we use, they are very sophisticated, but they go to short and medium term, which usually is 6 months and then a couple of years, up to 3 years. And yeah, it's not possible to model the impacts for the next 10 to 15 years. So that's something where it would be entering speculation. And so you're completely right that what we show is negative impacts in the short and medium term. Yeah, and then it will be very difficult to foresee the long-term impact.
All right, thanks, guys. Thank you, Ryan. Thank you, Philip. I'll hand over to David now, David Walwyn from the University of Pretoria. I mean, the one thing that kind of comes to mind a little bit for me is that the ultimate goal of the local procurement rules actually matter if you're thinking about long term, and how long they stay in place also matters if we're talking about short versus long term. So it might be, maybe, David, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, but also feel free to just respond in the way that you feel most comfortable. Thanks.
Appreciate. You want to put that in the form of a question? I'm not sure that I really followed what you wanted me to answer.
Sure. No, I suppose I'm not answering it, putting it as a question, because I don't want to influence the conversation too much. It's just, I suppose the question that comes to me is if you're the modeling that was done was a short, as Ryan pointed out and Philip said, it showed short-term impacts. And what you would want to think about also further then eventually is, well, what are the longer term impacts of these things? If there are short-term costs, can they be made up by the long-term gain to the actual structural change that happens as a result? But that also then brings to mind, should public procurement rules be permanent things that are always in place, or should they always have time limits to how long they stay in place? To maybe avoid the dependence and the perpetual avoidance of competition over time.
Okay. All right. Well, let me partly answer that and then go into my what I was going to say. So I'm going to answer that in the context of my background. I started off in pharmaceuticals and was very interested in how to develop a local pharmaceutical industry. And I guess I came into the whole discussion in the late 1980s, early 1990s, when WTO was really at the peak of its kind of influence over South Africa and resulted in major tariff reforms in the 1990s. And I actually sat on the board on tariffs and trade in 1996, so that's a long time ago now. But that was when the Board of Tariffs and Trade then was implementing this very radical change to the tariff structure in South Africa, which had huge impact. Of course, it dropped prices for consumers, but it decimated local industry. And we know, that's quite well documented, although not perhaps as well as it should have been. And I think there was this huge shift ideologically towards supply side incentives, and I was working in innovation, so I was really interested in innovation policies, and worked for quite a long period in innovation policy. So, I guess a lot of people would have, what's the difference between innovation policy and industrial policy? Do they overlap? Are they same? Is one a subset of the other, etc.? But I mean, all the time they were, for me, twin areas: innovation policy and industrial policy. And local content requirements was something that was always on the agenda, particularly in pharmaceuticals. And my interest was antiretrovirals. And I'm sure Stavros is going to have something to say about this. But in my view, and this is documented, Aspen Pharmacare can thank its kind of stellar growth, particularly in the 2000s, to the implementation of designated industries for formulated antiretroviral production. So that's, if you like, one success story, albeit for a single private sector company, but there were others that also benefited. Let me just say briefly what I felt about Philipp's presentation. Philipp, thank you very much, first of all. I guess this is a macroeconomic study, and I've seen many examples of CGE models and even system dynamics models now, which are attempting to answer these big questions. And I think they are big questions, and everyone struggles with the same question, which is we're well intentioned. We want to stimulate local industry, we want to grow jobs, we want to grow GDP. And so we design a policy instrument, and it looks like it's going to have the right outcome, and then it has a whole set of unintended consequences, which you have indicated. So LCRs may well have a positive benefit, but then there are a whole lot of casualties, if you like. So the things that I think are important, you concluded with that the important thing is in the design of policy is coherence, effectiveness, and impact. And I mean, I've heard those same three things for probably 20 years, and it's sort of a little disappointing that now, with the power of CGE and computation and the greater data that we've gathered about national economies, that we still come to the same conclusion, that when we design policy, we should be careful about coherence, effectiveness, and impact. And so in a way, I was looking for something slightly more from what you had done, and particularly in respect of South Africa. So how do we design effective LCR policy in South Africa? What are the things that are important? And I'm going to give an example from my recent interest, which is in the energy transition. And there's been a lot of work. Well, there were, photovoltaic panels, for instance, are a designated industry, if you like, or photovoltaic panel manufacture. And there was a study done a few years ago by Lucy Baker and a couple of others showing that the LCRs were just being abused by local companies. In other words, they falsely claimed LCRs, and then they weren't properly administered. And I mean, I think if I look back over this very long period being involved in policy, that South Africa has this plethora of policies, really a very complex mixture of policies. And so the problem isn't policy, it's monitoring, evaluation, and learning. So we just don't do MEL very well. And I think Philipp made that point as well. Thank you for making that point, that we have to embrace three things, I think, and perhaps Philipp won't agree completely. It'd be interesting to hear. But the three things that I think need to be embraced, first of all, the idea of policy experimentation, that you can never a priori determine whether a particular policy is going to have the impact that you want it to. That's so you have to accept that it's experimentation, and that it's not as if you're going to learn from other people's examples, and this is definitely going to work. So the second thing is then you have to have proper monitoring and evaluation and learning systems so that you can abandon policies if they're not working in the way that you want them to, and have the honesty to do that. And then the third thing, which I think is something that's very overlooked in policy, is what I call regime destabilization. So economists don't tend to think in these terms, and it comes out of historical institutionalism. So it's the idea that pathway dependence is incredibly powerful in ways that you would never even begin to imagine. And so in order to get change in any industry or any sector, and in this case, we're talking about heavy transport, in order to get change, in order to stimulate local production or to create jobs or create additional value addition to local raw materials, you have to think about who are the existing beneficiaries, and you have to work out how you are going to undermine them, how you're going to destabilize them, how you're going to loosen their grip in the way in which markets operate. And we don't do that properly in South Africa, and I think it's a great shame, and that's why we often get derailed, if you like, in terms of our industrial policy. So I take a much more radical view than the idea that you just need the stick and to some extent the carrot. You need the penalty. You actually need something much bigger than that. You need regime destabilization. You need to actually take the carpet out from underneath of the existing beneficiaries who are going to do whatever they possibly can to destabilize, or not to destabilize, to undermine the initiatives that you're busy implementing. So I think I've gone well over my time limit, but those are my 3 points. Thank you.
Thank you so much, David. Philip, I mean,
Yeah.
any response from you, I imagine?
Maybe just very briefly, first of all, thanks very much, David, for pointing this out. I agree very much with what you're saying. These words that I used are actually, so at the end of my PowerPoint, coherence, effectiveness, and impact, they're actually taken from the event description that we received. And I just employed them to tie back the presentation to our event. But I completely agree that, the story goes far beyond that. We need much more than that. And what I did was to present the study that we have done a couple of years ago as an example of LCRs that ended up, at least in our analysis, having negative effects. But for the picture of South Africa specifically, what I just want to say is that I agree with your points. So from my perspective, as I mentioned, for South Africa, the advice from our study, which goes beyond South Africa, is not so specialized in it, would be, as I mentioned, to have an informed use of LCRs. So conduct impact assessments, economic research before, to have a design that is clear and not vague, and also to have more incentive-based, a bit more carrot than just the stick. But then we go to the idiosyncratic characteristics of the South African situation, and that's also an area where we haven't focused our study on too much. So I was here to set the scene a bit. But one thing I can say is that I agree with your point that South African policymakers should definitely profit from lessons learned internationally. So we do see, when it comes to LCRs, regardless of CGE modeling, which does also have its own limitations, these models are very good at the very least at presenting trends. So we do see that we have positive trends in specific sectors, but negative trend in other parts of the economy. So we have these negative effects, at least as a trend that are indicated. But it is important, in my opinion, for policymakers in South Africa to listen more to the international best practice, to see and research what has happened abroad, what have others done, how did it turn out, how did it work out, where did it create problems, what type of LCRs work, what types of LCRs have proven to work less well, and what could work well for the case of South Africa. So I agree with your points that were about more decisive action when it comes to understanding, research, learning from others, and this monitoring aspect before the implementation. Thank you.
Yeah, I also particularly like what David said about the monitoring and evaluation along the road as well, and not the kind of buying into the sunk cost fallacy where, well, we've implemented it now, it would now stay in place for a very, very long time, even if we are somewhat suspicious of some of the negative externalities that are coming from it. But with that, I'll hand over to Stavros Nicolaou. Thank you so much. I'll hand over to you with a clean slate, and you can respond to what you've heard. Thanks.
Okay, so I'm battling to open my camera. Perhaps the host is able to do that for me.
While we try, I think Stavros, you can carry on, and then I'll ask Margot to try and figure that out.
You're probably better off not seeing my mugshot anyway. So colleagues, Good afternoon, and thanks very much. I think these are immensely important conversations for the country, and particularly where South Africa presently finds itself. I think you'll find that much of what I say is going to be complementary and probably supplementary to what David said earlier. I'm going to, certainly for the first round, I'm going to preface and lean significantly on the pharmaceutical industry's experiences. And I guess the starting point here is that South Africa has one of the worst and disproportionate disease burdens of any country around the world. I think our HIV and TB statistics are well recorded. We have a rising tide of non-communicable diseases such as diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and others. So you would think with that backdrop that we would be producing most of our vaccine and pharmaceutical requirements. Regrettably, nothing can be further removed from the truth. We continue to be a serial importer, and our trade deficit in the sector grows year on year. The trade deficit is more than half of the size of the entire market. So what are the instruments we have at our disposal, given that we have agreed as a country, these are cabinet government decisions that are reinforced with the African Union's targets that the AU has set for itself. And so in the instance of South African government, they've agreed that the pharma sector should be one of the key priority sectors for industrialization. The African Union has stated in resolutions that 60% of the continent's vaccine and medical countermeasures requirements should be produced within Africa. And to give you a sense, 99% of African vaccines are imported, and around 90% of pharmaceuticals are imported. Okay, so I'm giving you that background. It's important background because I'm going to segue into an important point. And the point is, when one pursues an industrialization, or in some instances a reindustrialization project as a country, one has to look at within existing fiscal constraints and cutting our cloth accordingly. What are those levers and or instruments that are A, practical, and B, affordable? And we've identified, as David said a long time ago, that preferential procurement, or more recently we have seen the President of the Republic assenting to the Public Procurement Act. So you've got a number of statutes that compel the public sector to commit to preferential procurement. And certainly in the case of pharma, if there was both commitment and execution, we would be not saddled with the trade deficits that I spoke about earlier and the trade deficits that grow annually. So this is an important lever, is preferential procurement. And also let me kind of dispel any myth. I think David did this already, but when we introduced the Preferential Procurement Framework Act, the Triple PFA as it's known, I think it was in 1996. Of course, a year earlier, as David indicated, South Africa became a member of the WTO, and there were certain mandates and commitments that we had to adhere to, and we significantly reduced tariffs, and I think industry paid for that, as David said. But one of the things we did check as a country is there's a multi-plural arrangement, and the preferential procurement, the way it was devised in South Africa, does not fall foul of SA's WTO commitments and or requirements. I think let's just sort of clarify that up front. So let me go to now, why has it been that certainly in the pharma industry and in many, many other industries, why has the Triple PFA not worked? And now I'm going to pose sort of my 3 points here for a response. The first of those is a lack of policy cohesion, as surprising as that might sound to some of you, but you have this dichotomy where designation in terms of the triple PFA, and of course the regulations were set aside by the courts, but the Act still is in place. But even when the regulations were in place, you had this dichotomy where trade and industry were the ones that designate but don't manage the budget. The line ministry, in this instance, Department of Health, manage the budget. And Health was saying our mandate is not preferential procurement, it's not industrialization, it's not job creation, which absolutely astounds everyone, but that's the case. So you had this dichotomy, and Health partly committed to it. It was done in fits and starts. And the bottom line is we haven't seen preferential procurement in the pharmaceutical industry where most of the volume resides. So it's important that the public sector is the custodian of most of the pharmaceutical volumes in the country. Around 52, 53 million people in the country rely on the public sector, and about 9 or 10 million on the private sector. So you can see how important it is if this is to be an important lever. So I'd like sort of point one here is, how does one achieve policy coherence, policy coordination with competing and very different, I suppose, ministerial and or departmental mandates? So that's issue one. Issue two has been the health department continuously says we are embracive and want to execute on localization. However, we are not the department that should be picking up any premium. We've got an already stretched budget, increasing demand and expectation, and we shouldn't be picking this up. Someone else should be picking it up. And again, I think it speaks volumes for I suppose, the lack of commitment in many respects, which is rather disappointing. But it does bring into question, and David did some work, I remember, in the mid-2000s on this. Should a country be paying a premium to support its local industry, and what premium should you be paying? The rather myopic view by the health department, and again, I'm not entirely blaming them because they do have stretched budgets, but their view has been that if they can save R1, seeing that David raised ARVs, R1 or $1, whatever the case might be, per pack of ARVs, and the state is buying 1 million packs, they're saving the country $1 million, and that's a good procurement decision. However, it's a very poor procurement decision if you consider that the state might be losing $3 per pack on the multiplier effect and or impact back into the economy, both up and downstream. So in the example I've just given you, the state is $2 worse off, which means off 1 million packs, they've lost $2 million or 40 million rand. So in that instance, it represents a poor procurement decision for the country. So I guess the point here is, who picks up a premium, if there is a premium, because I'm not suggesting that the local producers all need a premium. Sometimes the local price is less expensive than the imported price. And I can go into poor monitoring and evaluating, because very often the state buys an imported product in the healthcare sector that actually costs more, but that's a monitoring and evaluating issue, which David also referred to. So I won't get to that point right now. My point here is, what premium should be paid if there is one to be paid, and what does that premium look like? What percentage or what value? And then the third and final point is one of leveling the playing field and cutting your cloth, right? And very often the emperor is found naked, unfortunately. So what do I mean by this point? There are, of course, a range and a suite of levers and instruments, industrialization, localization levers and instruments that one could employ. It's, I think, well recorded that our fiscal position in 2025 is not what it was in the heady days of Trevor Manuel, when we had 24% debt to GDP. We ran 3 consecutive years at the peak of Trevor Manuel's finance ministry term. We ran 3 consecutive years of a budget surplus. We were in a very, very different position, and one could support a different range of incentives. But given where we are as a country right now, we can't give similar incentives. There are SEZ offerings that are perhaps not as competitive. So this thing about leveling playing fields, we become increasingly reliant on preferential procurement as a very important, if not the apex lever in industrialization in my sector, certainly. So the question is that if this is one of the few levers that you've got, and fiscally you can't really look at others, there's little wriggle room, then we ought to be implementing this more efficiently and effectively, and we're not. So the point here is juxtaposing preferential procurement to achieve offtake agreements to ensure competitive economies of scale, because that's what manufacturing is all about, is how competitive can you be through your economies of scale. So if we don't have any other levers other than this one to create those economies of scale, then unfortunately we are going to get less and less of a tax base from the sector, and you are going to have fewer and fewer investors. So that's kind of my third point, and I'd be interested to hear what the response could look like, and I'll come back for a second round later, I suspect. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stavros. Philipp, I don't know if you have any direct response to that. I mean, that was all very practical, and
I mean,
yeah.
Just briefly, I mean, I'm very aware that this comes from the business perspective, which oftentimes is a very, very interesting perspective, because it's the actual actor on the ground. They live in the reality, and they use trade and, for example, also procurement on a day-to-day basis. I completely agree with the points made, and I am a little bit also in agreement with David's point that it might be a little bit, yeah, if not frustrating, then at least sobering to see that we seem to be having the same problems for years or even decades. And I mean, if I listen to dichotomy of ministries and also, yeah, you know, inefficiencies, these are of course problems. But my reaction to specifically would be, despite agreeing to it wholeheartedly, that the tool of preferential procurement, or LCRs per se, it also cannot do everything. It's a limited tool. When we talk about increasing competitiveness of production of scale, when we are talking about job creation and also industry development, there are other tools that we should consider as well. And basic tools in this regard, for example, are education, attractiveness for investors, capacity building, local structures, for example, when it comes to attracting international talent, yeah, things like this. So industrial policy, spending and R&D, also public spending and R&D. So the tool that I was asked to present, LCRs, it is a limited tool when it comes to economic diplomacy.
Yeah, I mean, it might be worth when we do a bit of a round robin to close off, it might be worth reflecting a little bit on what the goals of these LCRs are or should be or can be and cannot be, because I think from the discussion, again, admitting all my ignorance, from the discussion at least, it does feel like at least I had a somewhat different view to what public procurement and industrial policy more broadly should be trying to achieve. But we can talk a little bit about that later. Annie, I'll hand over to you to give a bit of response and help us think a little bit more clearly about how gender plays into all of this discussion.
Oh, thank you very much. It's been very interesting so far to listen to everybody and their views. And yeah, I think the last two webinars focused a lot on the fact that women are not really involved in the industrial economy, except maybe as employees, and usually not in technical positions as employees, but certainly not women-owned businesses. And David very ably pointed out that data is lacking, and it's severely lacking when it comes to women and women-owned businesses and the involvement of women in these sectors. So we're starting very much on a back foot. I think Stavros pointed out that there is some good policy. There's the triple PF, as he mentioned. And then, of course, I've mentioned in the first industrial policy webinar that there is the GRPBMEA framework, gender responsive planning, budgeting, monitoring, evaluation, and auditing framework, very big word, which requires all policy and programs to be gender mainstreamed. But this has not really been done very successfully. We're not seeing major shifts in the economy towards the inclusion of women. So in theory, LCR would be good for women because it's bringing in more local content. But where women are absent, of course, this is not going to be the case. And so if we want to accrue any benefits from any of these policies, our focus has to be on building up women-owned businesses and skills and training, which was just very recently said in this webinar, and also addressing issues such as financial inclusion, because women are not easily able to access finance in order to be able to start their businesses or grow their businesses. So we're very much on a back foot. So I think I would probably like to focus a little bit, if you don't mind, on the value and supply chains where there are opportunities for women. Because, of course, we need to look outside of the industrial activities and look at the goods and services that are required by these industrial services, because this is where women have their best opportunity to be able to provide support and take advantage of any growth as a result of any of these policies that might grow the industrial economy. I'm not sure if many of you know, this comes as a surprise to a lot of people, but for instance, women are found more and more in the logistics supply chains. This is because you no longer need to own a truck. You just need to have a computer and sit at a desk and tie people up. So for instance, I lived in Botswana for 2 years and discovered that the 6 companies that move goods back and forwards from South Africa to Botswana are all owned by women. So these are areas where you could start building up more preferential procurement from women-owned businesses, and start looking at across the supply chain of where you will find them. And this is where we'll find our best benefits. So I also wanted to touch on something that nobody has touched on at all, which is targets. They're very unpopular. And the reason is that people don't like reporting failure. And unfortunately, that is what tends to happen when you have targets. Tanzania, for instance, has a 30% target for procurement by women-owned businesses across a broad supply chain, not just in the industrial sector, but they have very strong programs that support this. For instance, they have gender bonds that provide access to finance for women-owned businesses at very preferential rates and processes. So I don't know if any of you remember but back in 2022, at the State of the Nation, our president, Cyril Ramaphosa, said that we were going to have a target for 40% procurement by government for women-owned businesses. And this has never materialized. And I sort of understand why, because it's a huge jump, but it's just completely been ignored. And I think there's a hope that the existing policy will try and drive more growth of women-owned businesses and procurement from women-owned businesses over time. We do have some other policy that, for instance, the DMRE, which is now the Department of Energy and the Department of Minerals, but at the times produced a piece of policy called WEGI, Women Economic Empowerment and Gender Equality Strategy, which was designed to support women in the REAP, the Renewable Energy Independent Power Producers Program, which of course is an industrial program. It's around solar panels and other green energy. And for the life of me, I can't get any information on what has been the success of that program for women. I have tried very hard, and so, I mean, one suspects that it probably has been more difficult to procure for women than was originally thought. Some private sector companies, or partly companies that are more focused on private sector initiatives, like the IFC, the international, they have secured large volumes within its supply chains for women-owned businesses. So we do have good examples. They've completely transformed their supply chain, and we probably need to investigate how they've done it and if we can gain any lessons from it. But without data, we can't really measure the impact. We don't know if there's an impact. We don't even know if it has any depth at all. I was involved in the process with the Gauteng provincial government, who wanted to push a preferential procurement process with the automotive sector in Pretoria. But on the construction side, and the amount of effort that they took to get women into that process was massive. They had to hire 2 community workers, hold very big meetings in halls. They had to sit with women to help them put in tenders. They had to get agreements from the private sector that they would work very closely with these women-owned businesses so that they would provide the goods and the women would provide the services, because the women couldn't get access to finance. What I'm basically trying to say here is that this is not easy. And I think asking me to give a talk on gender mainstreaming in LCRs was probably a bit of a reach. But I hope that I've given some perspective on how difficult it is, how much of a failure most of our policy has been, how the lack of data really doesn't help, and see if there's anything that can be done to use these processes to empower women. It'd be great. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Annie. I think, Annie, it might have been a bit of a reach, but I think a lot of that is because it hasn't been part of the conversation, the LCR conversation before, at least according to my knowledge. So I'm hoping this will at least bring the gender dimension into the conversation of LCR going forward, if it does anything else. We are a little bit over time. Just in terms of, before we kind of do a final round robin and then go into the Q&A session, but maybe what I'll do is, Philipp, I'll start with you again, and maybe you can just kind of give your final minutes and a half reflections on the conversation that we've had, and then we'll go down the line, and then we'll open it up to the audience.
Yes, thank you very much. So again, just wanted to say that I very much agree also with the points made by Annie, and I wanted to use this opportunity to thank the experts on South Africa's policy for their contributions, and I hope that the presentation of our international perspective and international study was useful. And the main takeaway for me is, I mean, I don't want to repeat the points that I made too much, but I think the main takeaway is that there's ample opportunity in listening to the international best practice more. And I mean, we in the European Union are clearly struggling as well. I would even say that one aspect for South Africa would be an emphasis simply on competitiveness. So to not rely on preferential tools or LCRs too much, but to focus more on the bread and butter issues that the EU is struggling with as well. I mean, for example, when you consider the Draghi report, we need to do investments. We need to build public R&D. We need to facilitate and support private R&D. We need to spend more in attractiveness for international talent. We need to build in education. We need to build more on infrastructure. And we need to basically focus a lot on trade competitiveness and the competitiveness of local industries so that they are less needing preferential trade policy tools. And that's an international perspective, for example, from the EU. And otherwise, thankful for all the points that were made. I'm completely in agreement. I believe monitoring, research, it's very important. And yeah, I think LCRs do have opportunities. They unfortunately also have limitations. And it seems there need to go more resources into analyzing impact of use of LCRs also in South Africa. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Philip. Ryan?
Yeah, just to echo, thanks everyone for I mean, thanks for inviting me and thanks for the paper and thanks for listening to us, to the audience and so on. Maybe I'll just end by noting a few broader points. I mean, I echo all obviously the whole kind of environment in which industrial strategy is happening in South Africa is highly unfavorable, and there's a whole range of things that need to happen, from education to infrastructure, network industries, and so on and so forth. One thing that hasn't come up, I don't think, is the whole. I mean, it's come up in passing, is the Public Procurement Act and what it does with preferential procurement, which I think we really ought to be grappling with. So, as we would know, there's been a great deal of legal uncertainty. Currently, local content procurement is not really, I mean, there's no national local content requirement anymore, as far as I recall. Organs of state can kind of go in their own directions. The Public Procurement Act tries to address that, but it is not enforced yet, and it is subject to legal challenge. So, there's just massive kind of just legal uncertainty in the system currently. Should the Public Procurement Act pass legal muster, which is a very open question at this point, the preferential procurement chapter of it introduces a whole range of new legal mechanisms. One of which, for example, is almost, I mean, people often refer to it as kind of local procurement, which is basically the idea that procuring institutions in South Africa would be allowed to basically set geographical set-asides. This has potentially large impacts on the industrial economy. It could fragment our procurement markets quite significantly. And there just needs to be quite a bit of economic analysis and grappling with that particular part of the Act. There's also other opportunities in the Act, which is stuff like more relational procurement methodologies. Currently, what we have is a system, especially at the lower end, which highly favors annual open competitive tendering. There's a dynamics of cutthroat competition where you've got large numbers of fly-by-night operations that are bidding low, undercutting the ability of established firms to maintain capacity and so on and so forth. It's not good from the perspective of fostering emerging businesses. The Act might provide some space for more relational methodologies, which provide long-term certainty in terms of building capacity and so on. These are all things we need to grapple with, and I'll leave things there.
Thank you so much, Ryan. David.
Okay, I mean, just a very brief comment from me, because I think I've said what I need to, and I'm interested to hear the discussion on the questions. So the comment, I mean, I think we're getting a little bit confused between preferential procurement and local content requirements. The two, okay, there's overlap, but the two are quite different. And I'm particularly interested in Annie's perspective on this, in the sense that I don't think LCRs are the best instrument for mainstreaming gender, for gender mainstreaming. You know, preferential procurement certainly, but I'm not sure. I don't know how it would work with LCRs, quite honestly. I don't see how you could design a specification in which you have gender mainstreaming or gender representation in the LCR conditions. But then, yeah, maybe there are types of LCRs that can recover it. So there was just a question on that. But otherwise, I'm looking forward to the Q&A answers.
Awesome, thanks. Stavros?
I'm struggling to put the camera on again for some reason. It's probably my reflexes aren't as good as they ought to be. Okay.
That's okay.
So look, I think many points have been made that some of which are pretty obvious, I guess, and other are slightly more complex in nature. And I think what's important is to kind of synthesize or to kind of distill this into what's sort of fit for purpose for South Africa. And again, I keep referencing, you know, cutting your cloth accordingly. I think my sort of three takeaways here are the following. Number one, you simply cannot have industrialization front and center of your economic growth policy and job creation policy. And yet you've got very few levers to achieve that. And the lever that you have got here in this instance is at best suboptimally effective. So I think that's an important point to note, the context of this conversation and under what circumstances and conditions this discussion is taking place in the country. The second point is that we lament and have lots of debates in our country. Well, we have lots of debates about many things, but we have many debates about how do you transform society and build a black economic class in the country. There's a lot of scrutiny on BEE at the moment, and that hasn't been effective, and all of that. And I think that if you're to look at public procurement, seeing that the Public Procurement Act has come up a couple of times today, if you look at that act and what its intention is, and you consider some of the numbers, so we know that the state purchases around R1 trillion worth of goods and services. We know our revenue collection is about 1.4 trillion. So the rest of it goes into benefits and state employees, etc. So if you take R1 trillion over a 10-year period and don't even take any sort of discounted cash flow on that. So if you have around 10 trillion rand over the next 10 years at your disposal to look at supporting existing industrialists, expanding your industrialist participation, and also bringing in black industrialists who you can count on one hand, or at best two hands at the moment. You've then got to ask yourself a question, well, should this not be one of, if not the apex policy priority of the country? And I think the answer is pretty obvious. If you look at the benefits that could be derived, it's pretty obvious. So we need to fix this thing of public procurement. It's highly unacceptable that Treasury committed to have the regulations for the Public Procurement Act out within 6 months. President Ramaphosa sent it to the bill last May, so it's almost 18 months ago, and yet the regulations have not seen the light of day as yet. So we need to get these regulations out. But more importantly, let me pivot to my third and final point. If we all agree how important a lever this is for both localization and industrialization, and I agree with David, we shouldn't confuse local content with the preferential procurement. I mean, they're two different things. But if we are to be true to what I think many people have said today, that this is a very important lever, monitoring and evaluating and ensuring that you get coherence. In my industry, it would mean four departments cohering, and unfortunately, all four on a different page. They include trade, industry, and competition, national health, science, technology, innovation, and finance. So the monitoring and evaluating of this and the lack of adherence has to bear proper consequence. And that's going to mean that we once and for all need to settle the debate on what premium, how, why, and what methodology. And then what happens if there is a lack of adherence to both the policy and the law. And the consequence management here should be no different to what an auditor general picks up if there have been missteps. So this third piece really needs to be addressed. It needs to be addressed with speed. Otherwise, we will continue to fall more and more behind the curve. There's certainly not good news coming in the automotive sector. We know what's been happening with the steel sector. So you have a knock-on effect. And I mean, the automotive sector is a big sector for this country. And unless you start fixing some of the basics, I'm afraid we will continue to deindustrialize. To place it in some perspective, 22 years ago, manufacturing represented 21% of our GDP. We're now down to 11.5%. And yes, services have grown and all the rest of it, but it's reflective of how we've deindustrialized. And we simply cannot allow that to continue for much longer. I think this requires, above everything else, it requires diligence and execution. And if there is a lack of adherence, I think there should be proper consequence management. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Stavros. And then Annie, any final words from you?
Sorry, I was just struggling with the. So yeah, I do. I think I'd like to bring up the issue of the LCR and preferential public procurement, because they are completely distinct, but they work synchronous together. They work nicely together. If all of our industrialization is sent overseas and there is no local content, then there are less jobs, there are less businesses, there's less opportunities. So the more local content we can have, the more opportunity there are for new businesses to get involved. That was the link I was trying to make. It's very tenuous, I know, and I'm very excited that you think that bringing in the gender aspects into these things is a good thing, because I think so too. And I'd like to see how we can advance the cause for women-owned businesses to get more involved in industrialization, how we can use these instruments to do that, if at all. So I'm excited about that. So thank you very much for that comment.
Awesome. Okay, thank you so much to our panelists. I am now going to hand it over to the audience. So the audience that registered had submitted a couple of questions. I'm going to pose this to the panel. I'll probably mention someone that can answer, but feel free to jump in or chip in as you feel inspired to. And then to the audience, I also just want to encourage you. We do have the Q&A option for you to type your questions in that you might have. If you want to push back a little bit on the stuff that you've heard, please feel free to do so. It's a great place to really test your thoughts and test your ideas in an open safe environment. So please, I encourage you to do that. Maybe to start off with, it's kind of the first question that came up from the audience during registration, but Isaac from National Treasuries also posed the question where he says, are there good examples of public procurement that has worked effectively as an instrument of industrial policy? The question from the audience previously was, are there cases where it has worked successfully? And I want to add to this based on what something that I said previously is how do you measure the success of a local content requirement program? Obviously, Philipp's presentation at the beginning was a general equilibrium, but short term. I want to say Stavros's analysis of his experience in the pharmaceutical industry is obviously a partial equilibrium way of thinking, with touching on the general equilibrium side through the fiscus and the funding that can go into the economy and build that up. But it is very, very partial in its thinking, or partial equilibrium, not partial. To be clear on that. But if you do think about these programs, I mean, if you have to look back at a program in the future and go, well, this was really a success, what would you be seeing if you had to say that? I don't actually know who to hand this to, but maybe David, you actually answered the question in the Q&A, but I'd like you to elaborate a little bit on that for the audience more broadly, please.
Okay. I mean, I said there's just so much literature on this. It's kind of, can you hear me?
Yes. Sorry, I was looking for something else.
Okay.
Yes, absolutely.
I thought you were trying to find my face somewhere down.
No, got you.
Left hand. Okay, so here I am. Yeah, there's just so many examples. So I want to take the question seriously, but yeah, on the other hand, the literature is full of examples. But I just remember an example which is actually in the coffee and tea sector, mainly in the tea sector actually, which was about local content requirements for the proportion of teas that were manufactured by Unilever in their facility in Pretoria that needed to come from local producers. I think it was 30% or 40% had to come from local production. And the IDC then used that as the basis for building a tea plantation sector in the country, which employed literally thousands of people. And I mean, I always thought that was a fantastic example of how you could use local content as a way of generating employment, particularly, but also obviously economic activity. It was good tea. There was nothing wrong with it. It added a bit of a cost to the cost of tea, but it goes back to Stavros's point, the work that I did in the 2000s about, so what is the premium that we should be prepared to pay as a country for the fact that people have a roof over their heads and enough food to eat, and as a consumer. And, we all know what the price is that we pay for cars in the country, 25 to 30% higher than global averages in countries with zero tariffs. So the premium cars is high, and we do that because if it wasn't for the car sector, unemployment in the Eastern Cape wouldn't just be 40%, it would be 80%. I mean, I'm just exaggerating here for effect, but I think that the idea that we haven't yet settled this debate about the premium for local production, what we should be prepared to pay is it's still out there. Trump has muddied the whole discussion with his tariffs and this Make America Great Again and all the political toing and froing. And I think he has absolutely no understanding of world economics. So I'm not going to, I don't want to get onto Trump, but I think that the combination of tariffs and local content requirements, of course, are important in the niche management of developing countries. So I'm deviating a little bit from the question. The question was, give me examples of local content requirements which have worked and led to industrialization. And I'm just saying there are plenty out there, and I'm just giving the example of P. But the last thing I just wanted to say is that the one thing that we fail to recognize is that although there's international diplomacy, we don't have a lot of friends out there. You know, the world, each country is up there for itself. The world is a tough place. It's a place where there's intense competition for markets. And I think that in a way, South Africa has trusted the global marketplace more than it should be. And as a consequence, there's been damage to the economy. So we have neglected niche management when we should have supported it, and just made life more difficult for the development of new businesses in the country than we could have, simply because the world is sitting in this prevailing logjam, if you like, of a liberal ideology, which states that we should only use supply-side incentives. So let me stop there. Thanks.
Cool. Thank you. Maybe Philip, I mean, do you have any further, I mean, just also on the kind of secondary question that I was asking in terms of, well, you know, what is the definition of a successful local procurement policy? Is it one, because it is temporary? Would that be something that is seen as something that is successful, or the idea of a policy that remains in place in perpetuity, but while it's doing it, it is creating employment, and it's, you know, in at least the market that it's focused on, would that still be considered successful?
So, I mean, this is a very important question, and I think exactly the literature needs to be analyzed here. So there are, as David said, ample articles about positive examples of LCRs, and I think these should also be reflected, because other parts of the literature focus too much perhaps on, you know, negative side effects of LCRs. So success stories of LCRs could be, for example, simply, and we've seen this when it comes to solar industry in several countries, including India, for example. But I think also South Africa, at least on a granular level, years ago. I mean, first of all, you can support infant industries through LCRs. So that's very important. Then another success story of LCRs is that they may allow you to move up the value chain in certain industry sectors by protecting them. So you are basically allowing your industries a certain development phase while they are protected from international competition to some degree. Also very good justification for LCRs. Then there are also some environmental and very justifiable sustainability goals that can be achieved through LCRs, through the use of LCRs. For example, if you say production should achieve certain environmental sustainability degrees, etc. So there are very good justifications for LCRs, and LCRs can fulfill a clear purpose, especially, and this is something that became very clear again in this discussion, especially when it comes to specific country perspectives like South Africa, which is a very specific market in a very specific situation, and you cannot just broadly apply international findings to the case of South Africa. It's very clear that you know, the road to competitiveness is different than it is in other countries. LCRs need to be used differently. So the timing point you made is also important. So the negative effects of LCRs, they are also not endless. That's a fact, true. The dynamics of the economy depend on many factors. So LCRs are not detrimental forever. And I think it's good to use them. And it's also, as you mentioned, it's very important to know that they cannot achieve an endless purpose. So you cannot protect an industry forever through them. International competition may find another way, etc. And at the same point, their negative effects are also not endless. So your time dimension is a very important point. We are talking here in our analysis that I presented, short and medium term effects.
Sure. Great stuff. Thanks, Philip. I just want to, sorry, we will have a little bit of time to see if we can get more questions, but I want to take this opportunity to also allow David Kaplan to speak from the audience. I'm very excited that he has joined us today. He's a professor of business government relations at the University of Cape Town and really has a lot of experience in this space. So I want to take an opportunity to also just give David a couple of minutes to respond to what he has heard today.
Well, thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Perfectly, thanks.
Okay, great. So let me address the issue of public procurement. I'm going to address that specific issue, and I really want to take off from some of the things that Stavros said. What is the purpose of public procurement? The purpose of public procurement, and how would you know it's worked effectively? The purpose of public procurement is an industrial policy, an instrument of industrial policy. What you're providing is you're providing a market demand to a set of firms. You are saying government will procure from these local firms. We are helping you on the demand side. Now, it should be twinned with also policies on the supply side. So what you should do as a government is to do an audit of what it is that government actually acquires, what its procurement is. And where you've got large procurements that continue over time, that could provide the basis of getting firms close to the efficiency frontier because the demand is there, then that is potentially an area where you would use public procurement as an industrial policy lever. But you need something else there. You need to know that you've got efficient firms that will not just take the money and say thank you very much, but the firms will actually invest. You may put some requirements on there. Okay, we'll give you the demand, we'll take up your product, but we want to see you invest, or indeed we want to see you export. Either one of those. So in the pharmaceutical industry in South Africa, so just to take an example, you've got a need for pharmaceuticals of various sorts. HIV drugs, for example, will continue. This is a demand that government has, which is large, continue over time. It can provide the basis for efficient production. And there are some efficient firms there. Stavros's firm is one of those. So this may be an area where demand and supply come together, and you do public procurement. You may need some other supply side supports, but in the end result, what you're wanting, leave aside employment. Industrial policy is about creating firms that can produce output and they can export. And if using public procurement, you can provide that platform, that's the place to go. Now, what's not the place to go is to say something like, I don't know, government departments must procure clothing. That's neither here nor there to me. That's a demand thing that's limited, any firm, whatever. But where you've got clear demand on a long-term basis, married to effective firms that will reinvest the benefits they're getting from procurement, and ultimately what you want to get them to be is efficient firms that can provide at the same price as foreign firms. So there's no preference here. You really want to see them entering into export markets. And pharmaceuticals may be one area, but take another area. Take government's public housing policy. We are going to be building public housing for a very, very long time. There's a huge demand out there. What does that mean for flooring or plumbing or different components of the housing market? Could those be procured locally? Have we got effective firms that if we gave them that sort of procurement support, we could see them investing in developing further and hopefully getting to the international efficiency frontier and indeed exporting. And that's the way that I would see public procurement working, ultimately to create effective firms on scale. As Stavros said, scale is everything in the manufacturing sector. That's what we want, and we want to provide that scale to firms to allow them to become efficient and export. If If they don't do that, if they just continue to take the public support, etc., you eventually end the program. But if that's working and that gets them into the efficiency frontier, beyond the efficiency frontier, that would be your indicator of success. And that's where I would go. So I would say the South African government at this stage, do an audit. What is it you procure on a large scale that you will do over a number of years that could provide the basis for efficiency? Second part of the audit, are there effective firms that could meet this target? Go into a discussion with them of what it would take, what they would give in return for the market demand, the state demand they would get, and how would they grow their businesses to come to the efficiency frontier. Thank you.
David, thank you so much. Really, I think given a lot of guidance to a lot of our National Treasury friends that are here today with us, so that's really great. We do have a couple of minutes left before I'm going to close at 5:02. So Stavros, I mean, he was talking about the pharmaceutical industry there specifically, and then broaden it a little bit wider. But I was wondering what your views would be on that way of thinking, let's say.
Okay, so I think firstly, those were excellent and outstanding insights from David. It pains me as a Wits alma mater, my Wits is my alma mater to say that, but David was incredibly succinct, made a lot of sense. I cannot fault anything David said. I think perhaps one or two enhancements on what he raised. I think having effective firms and managing how you create the demand and supply is a very important consideration. And I think put slightly differently, what you can't get into is have artificial preferential procurement support, meaning phrased slightly differently, you can't put this in place to achieve rent seeking. So what do I mean by that? What I mean is you cannot pay for localization at all costs, and you cannot have a situation where you've in inverted commas carved out a volume from the industry that you're going to designate only for local production, only to be seen that this is an instrument that's used to escalate pricing. So with any good preferential procurement policy comes reference pricing that keeps the lid on the rent seeking, and it's very important that we would do so. It's tied in to some extent to what premium do you pay. So any premium that you pay has to be competitive, because at the end of the day, and David did allude to this, David Kaplan, that is, what we want to achieve ultimately is develop economies of scale so that there's no artificial or other need to support companies that are uncompetitive. So you should never do preferential procurement at the risk of achieving companies that are not going to be domestically and or internationally competitive. We've got to use this as an effective tool, not only to leverage domestic demand and domestic volumes, but also to turn this into an export orientation. And you can only do that if preferential procurement assists you to build competitive companies. Thanks very much.
That was great. Thank you, Stavros. Ryan, I don't know if you have any final responses before we close off.
I guess I could just add that one example of a successful procurement, industrial procurement with local content characteristics is the internet. Especially if you have a broad view of local content requirements, lots of US military procurement is really tied into the locality. And Yeah, that's an example. We wouldn't be having this conversation without local content requirements.
Very interesting. Any final word from you?
Yes, just to say that there is an example of a successful LCR, which is the personal protective equipment PPE that was produced during COVID-19. It was driven by the DTIC and National Treasury. They prioritized the procurement of locally manufactured PPE. And I should note that women were the major beneficiaries of that particular initiative. And it really helped grow their businesses. They were often producing uniforms for schools, and they were then thrust into a much more industrial process. So that's one good example, even if it is very small, not at a major industrial level. I think it probably made a big difference to some women's lives.
Fantastic. All right. But thank you so much. I think we can close off with that. I hesitate to bring it all together purely because I might get it somewhat wrong. But so I won't do it. But I will say thank you so much to everyone, specifically the panelists, Philipp, Stavros, David, Annie, and then David Kaplan. Also, thank you so much for being willing to provide us with the wisdom and the insights from all your years of work in this space. And I especially like the way that you packaged it in very much the technical way that I would think about it too. So thank you for that. Yeah, so just to remind everyone again, this was the third in our series on industrial policy. Our fourth one is next week. The advert and the invite has already been sent out by email if you're registered with ERSA or via LinkedIn. I imagine everyone that's here today probably is, given that you were able to find the webinar in the first place. But yes, thank you so much again. Thank you to everyone. Thank you to the team from DNA Economics. Thank you for the ops team from Economic Research Southern Africa for also helping us put together technical, and especially thank you to all the audience. If you do have any follow-up questions that you would want to share with us, or the way that you think about it, please feel free to put something online or even email us. And we can see what we can do for you. But with that, thank you so much, everyone. Have a good Thursday going forward, and a good weekend from tomorrow onwards.